Hi, this is lecture, actually discussion 1A for Monday, August 31st for History 111, History of World Civilization up to 1500 at Northland College. I posted the two lectures already, which were lectures, and that's where I'm presenting you with the sort of some facts of history. I'm talking about the process. I'm giving you a narrative of history. But history is actually a whole lot more than just facts and a narrative, because history is about making sense of the past, and it's about understanding how the past has shaped the present, and it's understanding why things happen the way they do in the past. And most importantly, it's about trying to figure out how things work out in human history so that we can figure out how to do it better in the future. We can understand what's shaping history now so that we can make the future better. So studying the past is a way for us to understand how things were shaped in the past, what forces were shaping human development, how human psychology interacted with economics and environment and on all of that. And so you really have to, if you really want to understand that, you have to think about not just the facts of history. It's not just something you memorize. You have to put those facts into a meaningful, coherent framework. Right? And often that means asking good questions of the facts and saying, how can the facts answer this question? Right? So today for this discussion, I'm going to be looking at a couple of questions. And the big question is, I talked in the lectures about how agriculture developed, right? And I talked about these different places that agriculture developed. But the question is, why did agriculture develop there? And not in, say, Cuba or Thailand or California. Why did these places develop agriculture independently and other places didn't? Right? And a second question related to this is, in some places human beings were clearly starting to domesticate plants and animals, but it didn't develop into the whole Neolithic revolution with cities and developed populations, etc. So then a second question is, why did some places develop the full-blown civilization and other places didn't? Right? And so these are big questions. In the first part of this discussion, there's going to be two parts. This is 1A. In the first part of the discussion, I'm going to look at why could some places not develop into civilization and full-blown Neolithic revolution and other places did. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about the theories of a biologist named Jared Diamond about why agriculture started in some places and not in others. Okay. So for this one, I just want to look at this list for a second. I just want to point out that I have this list actually shows you rough dates on when agriculture developed in these places. And the more important date here is the later one. Sometimes you just get one date, sometimes you have a range. The later one is when we're sure they have developed agriculture by that time. Right? And this is mostly based on archaeological digs, where they're finding seeds or evidence of certain plants in their domesticated form already in certain places. So like, okay, we're finding, this soil level is at 8,500 BC, and we're finding fully domesticated einkorn wheat seeds. So we know they had that, right? The earlier date is more speculative. We have some evidence, but we really don't know when people started domestication, because as I mentioned in the lecture, the process of domesticating plants and animals is often a really slow, gradual process, right? I mean, for instance, it's really common amongst Australian Aborigines who were hunters and gatherers to, if they found a certain type of plant, a certain type of yam or taro, they realized that they could pull the plant out, and here's a tuber on the bottom. They could eat the tuber, but then if they stuck the plant back in the ground, it would grow again, and they'd get another tuber. Right? Now they wouldn't stick around weeding and hoeing and watering it or whatever. They would just simply make sure they stuck it back in the ground, and they knew that the next time they came through here, they'd find more tubers there. Right? Whereas if they pulled up the plant, ate the tuber, and threw away the plant, they don't find more tubers next time. So is that cultivation? Maybe, right? And then there's certainly places where groups would plant a field of, say, corn in the Americas, and then they would move on, and they would go forage and hunt and gather for months, and then they would come back and gather up all the corn and then take it with them. Now, they weren't watching it, they weren't weeding, they weren't fertilizing, they weren't sitting there. It wasn't intensive agriculture, so their yields were pretty low. But is that agriculture? Probably, right? And so it's a gradual process. And also, domestication is a process of genetically modifying plants, right? Every plant in its domestic form is much more productive for human needs than in its wild form. And so, for instance, wild strawberries are very small, and tiny domesticated strawberries are huge, so we can eat more easily. And wild wheat has a habit of shattering. When it gets touched, it shatters, so the seeds would scatter everywhere. But humans don't want that, so they bred a strain of wheat that doesn't shatter. You can just harvest it and then beat the seeds off into a basket or something. So there's lots of ways that domesticated plants are more suitable for human needs. Or corn comes from this original plant, was teosinte, which is this tiny thing. The whole cob is like that big, and there's not much food on there, and humans bred that into these huge corn cobs with big kernels, right? So, but that's a gradual process. So when humans first started cultivating wheat, does that count as agriculture, or do they have to domesticate the wheat all the way up to the point where it doesn't shatter and spread the seeds everywhere? When they start eating tiny strawberries, and then they gradually breed them up into big strawberries, is that, what's the point at which agriculture started? Right? So these are all rough estimates, and if there's a single date, it just means that that's the earliest evidence we have. Here, there's some evidence of earlier cultivation. So generally, these are in order of the last date, the date we're sure they had agriculture. So the Fertile Crescent, which I mentioned, is in the Middle East. It's Iraq. It's parts of southeastern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and then down into what we would today call Israel. They had agriculture by about 8,500 BCE. China had agriculture probably by about 6,500 BCE. That one's a little iffier. New Guinea, we have some evidence they had domesticated plants by 7,000 BC. The African Sahel, which again is that strip of semi-arid land along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, that probably has 7,000 BC. Tropical West Africa, which is rainforest West Africa, different crops altogether, about 6,000 BCE. Ethiopia, there's some evidence that domestication might have started much earlier, but it's really sketchy, and Ethiopia very quickly adopted agriculture from the Fertile Crescent and from the Sahel, so we're not sure of when they developed on their own and what they borrowed. Mesoamerica, these are all roughly within a couple thousand years of each other. Now there's a break. Mesoamerica, 4,000 to 3,500 BC, so several thousand years later. Andes and Amazonia, which is in South America, modern day, Peru, Brazil, etc., is about 3,500 BC. And the eastern United States, which is the Ohio River Valley, is about 2,500 BC. So you can see that there's a gap here, if you will, that the old world, Africa and Eurasia, developed agriculture several thousand years before the new world in the Americas. All right? And I'll get into it in the second part of this discussion, why that might be. Why here and not there? Why did it develop earlier here and later there? That's a good historical question to ask. And I'll talk more about that later. But right now I want to turn and talk about a different issue, which is some of these places, if you think about, China is known as a cradle of civilization. The Fertile Crescent is the cradle of civilization. But we generally don't think of, say, tropical West Africa or the African Sahel or the Ohio River Valley as cradles of civilization, or New Guinea. And so one of the questions is, what's the difference? We have evidence that people were domesticating plants and animals, but it didn't seem to take off into the full Neolithic revolution with cities and complex governments and writing and all that. I don't want to say what went wrong, because there's no right or wrong, but why did they go one direction and other civilizations went another direction? And one of the keys here is that you can't really develop a sedentary civilization with high population densities and cities and writing and all that, you have to go all in on agriculture and animal cultivation, right? You can't be still doing some hunting and gathering, et cetera. You have to go all in. You have to really settle down. We're sitting in this one place. We're growing all the food we need on our own farmland. This is it, right? That's a pretty radical thing, to go from hunting and gathering to settling down entirely and being completely sedentary, right? And one of the keys to that is, just because you've domesticated a plant or an animal doesn't mean you can go to a totally sedentary existence, right? You have to actually have a group of plants and animals that will provide you with everything you need for your nutrition in sufficient abundance for the number of people you have, right? So it's one thing if you say, okay, we've domesticated strawberries, right? Can you settle down and just grow strawberries and live on strawberries? The answer is no, right? You can't keep them for very long, so they're only there for a few months, and then you don't have any food for the rest of the year, right? So you might domesticate strawberries and cultivate strawberries, but you're still going to be going off and being a hunting gatherer for other parts of the year, and that means you're not going to develop big cities, and you're not going to develop complex governments, you're not going to develop writing. Instead, you have to have a package. You have to have a set of foods that will provide you with all of human nutrition, and that you can preserve or at least access throughout the year in that one spot. And so basically, if you want to look at it from a nutritional point of view, you need three things. You need a complex carbohydrate for basic calories. You need a source of protein, because human beings need protein to avoid malnourishment, and you need a source of fat. Now, we can also talk about, you need things that provide with vitamins and minerals, et cetera, like that, but that's a sort of a minor issue. You need a major source of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And so if we look at the development of agriculture and animal cultivation, domestication in these places, we see that often that is the difference between developing a full-blown civilization with cities and governments and writing, et cetera, and developing some agricultural cultivation, but not completely committing to it and settling down. For instance, just to give an example, in New Guinea, about 7,000 BC, they had developed a couple of good crops, such as the sweet potato, but they didn't have a really good source of protein. They didn't domesticate any animals that they could use as food sources, and so in New Guinea, they were really close, right? There were several attempts that we have archaeological evidence of them trying to settle down and do a sedentary community, but they began to run into malnutrition problems because they didn't have a great source of protein. And so they eventually started to go do hunting and gathering again, and that meant they sort of abandoned sedentary agriculture. So New Guinea, they really didn't develop a full civilization, if you will, with big cities and governments and writing, even though they developed agriculture. They had invented agriculture, and they had a couple of good crops, but they did not have a good protein source. And it was only when the pig arrived from China through trade that New Guinea now had a package. With the pig, they had a source of fat and protein. So now New Guinea could settle down and do sedentary agriculture, and you began to see the sort of Neolithic Revolution changes happen. You began to see a sedentary civilization develop. But that was much later, because the pig had to arrive from China. Right? In a similar thing, in the eastern United States, in the Ohio River Valley, they did develop a couple things. They developed the sunflower seed, basically, which is a source of fat and some protein. And they developed sumpweed, which is sort of like a spinach kind of thing. But they really didn't have a good carbohydrate. And they had a hard time making a go of that. And there was certainly cultivation going on. They had domesticated these plants, and they were certainly cultivating them on some level, but you didn't develop a sort of sedentary agricultural society until the arrival, much later, of corn, beans, and squash from Mesoamerica, right? From Mexico, basically. Once corn, beans, and squash had moved north from Mexico into the eastern United States, up the Ohio River Valley, then you start to see sedentary agriculture develop. And so it's really only when the complete package is there that you can see the development of full-blown agriculture. And I just want to mention something I mentioned in the lecture, which is This is one of the reasons that you often see, I mentioned that the decision to go to agriculture was often not a good one because you had, workers, humans in an sedentary agricultural society, work many more hours a day than humans in a hunting and gathering society, and they're more malnourished. Right? And part of that is because often they had a package that was just good enough to allow them to survive in agriculture, but it wasn't good enough to provide them with a really good living and really good nutrition. And we'll see that in later things, for instance, much later in Europe, they really couldn't afford animals much in the early Middle Ages because they were trying to rely on a fairly sparse package of wheat, barley, and such as that. It's only when beans arrive in the 800s or 900s that a good source of protein is suddenly available, and you see malnutrition amongst bodies, and archaeologists finding bodies in Europe. Bodies start showing much less malnutrition after the arrival of beans because that was a really good source of protein. And then later they added lots of livestock for various reasons I'm not going to go into here, but you have to have a good package, otherwise you're sort of just hanging on with a malnourished population. But once you've sort of committed to sedentary agriculture, it's a hard thing to figure out your package doesn't actually work because you've already committed to settling down, and often that means you have a population that's grown significantly because birth rates are much higher in sedentary societies than in hunting and gathering societies. You suddenly have too many people to go back to hunting and gathering, so now you're locked into that, right? And so you're scraping by even if it's not a good existence. So this idea of you have to have a good crop package, you have to have a source of carbohydrate, source of fat, source of protein, that's really a necessity for completely committing to a sedentary agricultural society. And so that's often the difference that we see in these different experiences, is that they develop agriculture, they figure out agriculture, they've got all that down, but they don't have a good package, so they can't just commit to it completely, and so you don't see the sort of development of sedentary civilizations with cities and things like that you see elsewhere where they do have a good package. So this is discussion 1A. Discussion 1B will be about Jared Diamond, and we'll continue on this question of why here and not there.